Hey folks, Rob Avis here. This week's top 5 is pretty interesting. I've had a really interesting week. Recently I've started writing on a daily basis again. I used to do this at the beginning of Verge almost 14 years ago, and I did it for close to 8 years. So if you haven't been to our website, you can see the sheer volume of writing that I did over the first 8 years of our business. And I found that writing was really useful for helping me to formulate my ideas and my thinking around permaculture, around ecology, around energy, around food systems, around shelter, waste, and how they all fit together. And at some point, I just stopped. I'm not sure why. Maybe it was because we had kids and things were getting too busy. Maybe I thought that people weren't reading the blogs that I was writing. I'm not really too sure. I have to kind of do a bit of soul searching to figure out why it stopped. But sometime before Christmas, so November-ish, I started the writing process again, and it has lit an absolute fire inside of my head. Now, in addition to writing, I'm still consuming podcasts, I'm still listening to audiobooks, I'm still reading regular books. And so the writing, I think, provides my brain an opportunity to synthesize what it is that I'm reading. And so this week, the theme for my week, not one that I particularly chose, something that came to me through a podcast that I'm putting into the top 5 this week, is a podcast by Nate Higgins and Jason Bradford. Now, the podcast itself is all about the future of food, and I'll leave a link to it so you can have a listen to it for yourself in the top 5. And within this podcast, Nate and Jason did a really great job of categorizing and listing all of the key liabilities that they can see as it pertains to where energy and food crossover, essentially the Venn diagram, if you think about it, between the energy industry and the food industry. Now, just some reminders, the GDP globally right now is 99% correlated to energy production. And if you want to learn more about that, I recommend you check out Nate Higgins' podcast, The Great Simplification. It's a fantastic podcast, and there's lots of really great information as it pertains to energy and the environment and the economy. So, obviously, energy was one of the big liabilities that we're going to have to deal with in the coming years, because in addition to energy and economy being so closely linked, it turns out that every calorie of food that we consume uses roughly 12 to 30 calories of hydrocarbons to produce it, package it, process it, get it to your grocery store, and for you to go pick it up. So it means that if we have an energy supply disruption, we're going to have a food disruption because they're so closely linked. And right now, if you look at what's happening with energy in Europe, specifically Sweden, the power prices there went from 4 cents a kilowatt hour to 160 cents per kilowatt hour. Even if you don't know what a kilowatt hour is, you can do the math on what it looks like to go from 4 to 160. I think it's like a 40x increase, something like that, which is insane. And food is going to have a similar response in the event that it becomes in short supply, because we just can't live without it. And so one of the concepts that they talked about in this podcast was the probability of a GigaFamine. And I'd never heard of that before. I didn't know what they were referring to. But a GigaFamine basically means a famine that affects more than 1 billion people. And as a result of talking about the concept of a GigaFamine, they brought up the Irish famine, which happened in the 1800s. And I've just written a big blog about it, which is going to be coming out on the Verge website in the not too distant future. The famine happened from 1845 to 1852, so about 7 years in duration. And close to 1 million people died, and another 1 million people left the island of Ireland, meaning that the population decline was over 25% from the beginning to the end of that famine, which is absolutely unfathomable. Now, the reality is that there's nowhere really to go in the event that we have a gigafamine. The world is completely populated, and our population is much larger. And back in the 1800s, we weren't dependent upon fossil fuel to produce our food. whereas we are now. And so there's a lot more fragility baked into the system. Now, the fossil fuels that our food system depend upon have made it seem as though there's nothing wrong. I mean, you go to Costco and the shelves are filled. Every grocery store has food. And so we live in a pretty awesome time right now where you can focus all of your energy on your job, on your family, on whatever it is you want, really, because we live in this abundance paradigm right now. And that abundance is predicated on this incredible resource that is fossil fuel. And so it got me thinking, what is the world going to look like, or what do these food systems have to morph into in a energy scarce world? And as a result of some reading that I've been doing over the last few months, and this was my last top 5, I've been getting back into some kind of base principle stuff, specifically with Odom Howard and his brother Eugene, both ecologists, both deceased now, who are essentially considered to be the father of ecology. And I started getting into the concepts of energy pyramids and trophic pyramids, energy pyramid basically being a version of a trophic pyramid, and how energy basically moves from the very bottom layer, which is the decomposers, so like microbes and worms and beetles and all of the bugs that essentially take rotting proteins and cellulose and lignins and turn it into microbes and ultimately carbon and humus and nutrient dense soil, which allows our plants to grow in. And then you've got the producers, which is next up. And then after that, you've got essentially omnivores, and then carnivores, and then apex predators. And so as you go through each of these different layers, you've got essentially a 10% transfer of energy from one layer to the next, which means that 10% of what those organisms consume makes it to the next trophic level. And so depending upon where you exist within the trophic energy pyramid, will depend upon how much primary energy, which is essentially just the conversion of sunlight into whatever carbohydrates or fats are moving their way up the pyramid towards you. One of the benefits of being human is that we have the ability to be both plant-based and omnivorous and even carnivorous. And so we can occupy different trophic levels in that energy pyramid depending upon what our ecosystems are able to produce in surplus. So that makes us highly adaptable. And if we think about what permaculture is aiming to do, permaculture is really the conscious design of human-made ecosystems that support our energy, food, shelter, water, and waste needs. So it's really an ecological engineer toolbox that allows us to create energy pyramids that support ourselves and the ecosystems around us. And so the blog that I've written, which I'll link to in the show notes down below, is a discussion about how to make sure that the Irish famine never happens again, and that we are able to manage this energy transition that will be coming in the decades to come in a controlled way, to prevent a lot of the pain and suffering that we've had to endure before we had, a really strong understanding scientifically of how soils work, before we understood the consequences of the economic policies that were created during the Irish famine, and the consequences of not having a diversity in what we grow, both in plant and animal. And so I'm going to leave you with 2 quotes here, which is part of the top 5. We should take a lesson from the Irish famine. Monocultures of any kind are very vulnerable because one change and you're cooked. So we should be diversifying, wouldn't you say? Margaret Atwood. And the second one is one of my favorites. It's by Bill Mollison. The greatest change we need to make is from consumption to production, even if on a small scale in our gardens. If only 10% of us do this, there is enough for everyone. Hence the futility of revolutionaries who have no gardens, who depend on the very system they attack, and who produce words and bullets, not food and shelter. Bill Mollison. So number 3 of my top 5 this week, I got our West Coast Seeds catalog. So we're going to be going through this in the next couple of weeks. And I found it really interesting that the cover of the catalog was Help Repair the World. It's kind of interesting, and I think it's a sign of the times that people are recognizing that gardens are really important. I think having come through the last 3 years People have woken up to the fact that our supply chains are a little more fragile than they considered. And companies like West Coast Seeds are starting to respond to that, which I think is really interesting. It's a beautiful catalog. It's a beautiful catalog, and if you don't have one, I recommend going over to their website, signing up for them to send one to you so you can get a look at the seeds that they have to offer. In the podcast that Jason Bradford was speaking on that I just referred to, one of the interesting facts that they presented was that the hybridized seeds that we're growing in industrial agriculture right now have been so selected, so bred, so curated, that these seeds no longer have the epigenome that they used to have. And so they're unable to take advantage of healthy soils. So we've basically bred seeds that can only live off of fertilizers and require the use of herbicides and pesticides in order for them to survive. Now, for me, coming back to one of the permaculture aphorisms, the problem is the solution. This represents an incredible opportunity for people to get into seed saving and also seed sales. Now, seeds are very light, and they're basically just packages of information that you can ship around the globe for very little energy, very little effort. And as we move forward and people start recognizing that the food systems that we depend upon are hyper fragile, like we're basically setting ourselves up for another potato famine, the people that have the genetic diversity that they've been working on for years in their backyard gardens, and sometimes bigger than backyard gardens if you're really big into seed saving and seed selling, are literally going to be the purveyors of gold of the future. So the gold of the future will be seeds. It will be information that is captured within these tiny little packages that when you put them into the soil, you get a proliferation of food. So seeds are hyper valuable. And if you're looking for a hobby or potentially a new vocation, consider seed saving. It might be really interesting getting into that. And within that realm, there's so many different domains. I mean, you can focus on perennial seeds or perennial plants or annual plants. And then within that, you can look at food, and you can look at fiber, and you can look at forage, and you can look at pharmaceuticals. And so there's so many different niches within the world of genetics and seeds that are worth considering. And as a civilization, we've largely let a very small number of corporations manage all of that genetic material, namely Monsanto or now Bayer, and a few other crop science companies that control the majority of the genetics and the seeds on planet Earth, which is a pretty precarious place to be. Lastly, and I've kind of already talked about this, but I've been contemplating a lot about the idea of designing food systems specifically around trophic pyramids. So I talked about the Irish famine and kind of the lack of knowledge that we had when we were in the middle of that. We were growing one species of potato that had literally just arrived in Ireland 100 years prior. And as a result of growing one species, the minute that one species got a plight, a very large percentage of the population died of starvation. So not only do we have to understand diversity of the plants that we grow, but we also have to understand and study how ecosystems create these energy pyramids. And I think more work can be done within the permaculture space to really get clear on the different trophic levels and how to create really stable food systems. So for example, if there's way more green plants than there are herbivores, then we should make sure that the ratio of green plants on our property to the ratio of herbivores makes sense, which most farmers and hobby farmers kind of understand. Like, you can only hold so many cows on your property, and if you have too many, you're going to have to import feed from somewhere else. So if we're trying to build resilient systems, we need to understand how much feed our property produces so that we're not dependent on bringing in feed for our animals from other properties. And so that's going to form that herbivore layer. And herbivores include animals like cattle, geese, guinea pigs, rabbits, llamas, alpacas, goats, and sheep. And so these animals are going to have specializations that allow them to forage on different types of crops. For example, sheep and goats are better at browsing, and cattle are better at grazing. So understanding the type of vegetation that grows naturally on your property without any effort is going to inform the type of herbivores that you design into the system. And then when we move up to the next trophic layer, which is essentially the omnivores, which is going to include things like pigs and chickens, there's going to be a ratio of pigs and chickens or omnivores that you grow that are able to be supported by that lower trophic level. And it turns out that it's about a 10-to-1 ratio. So if you have 1,000 kilograms of herbivores, you're going to have 100 kilograms of omnivores. And we can go kind of up the trophic pyramid that way. And then we can even think about ourselves. So, how much do I weigh? How much food do I need? And so I can kind of figure out what my trophic level is, and then I can kind of back calculate out what that system is going to look like. And then from there, I can figure out what my land base needs to be. And I know it sounds complex and scientific, but again, we didn't have these tools during the Irish famine or even during the Great Depression. And I think there's a lot of insights that can be gained and a lot of simplification that can be done in order to create heuristics or rules of thumb for people that are trying to design their own ecosystems to support themselves. And so my mind has been in that space for the entire week, and it's going to continue to be in that space as I move forward, because this is something that I think about a lot, specifically permaculture design. So if you found any of that interesting, make sure you head over to our website, sign up to our newsletter. I'm back on the writing steam train, and so I'm going to be producing a lot of content in the coming months as I start to synthesize all the information that I've collected in the last 5 years that I haven't properly synthesized. I'm also going to be producing these videos on a regular basis, specifically my top 5 of the week, so make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel. And I look forward to seeing you guys on our channel, in our comments, and potentially in a future course. Okay, have a great day.
Well, here I am out in the weather, thumb is out and thanking you in advance. Won't you pick me up?